Now we go back to Leviticus, and this is Parsha Shemini, and Shemini means eighth. And that does figure into the Torah portion at some point. I do like to start with the blessing over Torah study. So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. So, as I said, this week's Torah portion takes us back to Leviticus after we had a brief detour into the book of Exodus for our Passover Torah portion. And this is a parasha that's filled with a large amount of narrative detail. As I said, Shemini means eighth, and this portion tells us that after 7 days of guarding the entrance to the tent of meeting, Moses instructs that on this eighth day, Aaron's sons, the elders of Israel, are to gather the proper sacrificial offerings as have been designated and enter the tent and offer them in the proper manner to God. The sacrifices are offered. Aaron and Moses come forward and they bless the people, and God's acceptance of these sacrificial offerings reveals his glory to all the people who are assembled there. This portion also goes on later to outline the laws of what would become kashrut, okay, our kosher system. It clearly spells out for the people what they may and what they may not eat. And as God reveals it and spells it out in the Torah, he says that the laws of kashrut are another way for the people to make themselves a holy people and to bind themselves to God. But I want to back up just a minute. There's an event in this parasha that many find quite disturbing. And I have to say that in my reading of it this week, I have to agree. It's so disturbing to have caused a lot of argument, a lot of debates, interpretation, a lot of discussion among our rabbis and sages throughout the many years of our long Jewish history. This event only takes up a few verses in this Torah portion, but it clearly requires a bit of a deeper look. So if we look at Leviticus chapter, verses 1 and 2, just after Moses and Aaron have blessed the people, God has made his presence known. I'm going to just mute everybody here. There we go. All right. So I've just muted everybody. That way, hopefully, to cut out background disturbance. Anyway, in Leviticus chapters 10, verses 1 and 2, just after Moses and Aaron had blessed the people, God has made his presence known, the Torah states, and now I'm quoting directly from the Torah, it says, now Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered before the Lord alien fire, which he had not enjoined upon them. And fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instances of the Lord. End of quote. Think about that. They're standing there, they made an offering, and the fire of the offering consumes them, and they die on the spot. Interesting. Moses' response to this rather shocking act, which he directs to his brother Aaron, he states, and again I'm quoting, this is what the Lord meant when he said, through those near me, I show myself holy and assert my authority before all the people, end quote. The Torah then tells us that Aaron was silent. His reaction to his son's death is silence. Moses then directs the other members of Aaron's family and Aaron's surviving sons to bury the remains of Nadab and Abihu outside the camp, but they should not follow the customary forms of mourning. Now, I find something somewhat troubling about these few verses of Torah on a couple of different levels. First, why is the fire offering of Nadab and Abihu referred to in the text as alien? Second, why does God see fit to kill them or consume them, as the word says in the Torah, with fire immediately, right there on the spot, standing at the sacrificial altar. Third, why is Aaron's reaction to this event nothing more than silence after he has just witnessed the death of his two sons? And fourth, what is the meaning behind Moses' sort of cryptic response to Aaron following this unfortunate turn of events? As I said, these couple verses of Torah, brief as they are, have engendered a great deal of discussion among our greatest Torah scholars for hundreds of years. So I'm not sure even in my own mind what exactly to make of them, but I'm going to give you a couple possibilities and then we'll discuss more. So Nadab and Abihu, being Aaron's sons, are of the priestly class, a status that certainly is respectful. They're ordained, and as such, they're permitted to enter the tent of meeting and to offer sacrifices to God on this 8th day. They do, in fact, accompany their father. They make the appropriate sacrifices as they've been commanded to do. Once the sacrificial rituals are completed, the people receive their blessing, feel the presence of the Lord, and all seems well and good. But then, Nadab and Abihu proceed to offer another sacrifice, each one individually, and this is where the, quote, alien fire comes into play. And what does the word alien suggest to us? What does it conjure up in our minds? The dictionary defines the word alien as a foreigner, someone or something that is not a part of us, something that is not like us. But fire is fire. So how can something such as fire be alien? The Torah also states that this fire was fire that God had not enjoined upon them. In other words, at least based on my reading, and free to disagree with me, it seems as though Nadab and Abihu are making an offering of some sort of additional sacrifice, one of their own design, that was not necessarily one that was commanded and prescribed by God. And because of that, or seemingly because of that, God consumes them by fire. So in doing this additional sacrifice, they are punished with death. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Have they overstepped their bounds in some way? Does God not want more than what he has specifically asked for and commanded? Are there limits on just how much should be offered to God? Are we to understand that in our religious fervor or our desire to attain a higher level of spirituality, maybe we can do too much, maybe we can go too far, we can go overboard, so to speak? And in doing so, perhaps we anger God rather than please God. Certainly seems to me as a bit of an overreach, though, on God's part. Did God somehow see their act of sacrifice as somehow not being sincere or genuine or of the heart? I don't know, because I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't pretend to know what God's thoughts are, but clearly God is trying to send some kind of message here. Equally puzzling in this short part of the Torah portion is Aaron's silence in the face of this act. We see no shock, we see no anger, we see no questioning of God's actions on Aaron's part. He's just silent. We know that each of us deals with death in a different way. Some of us may be extremely emotional with tears and disbelief and anger. We try, but often fail to understand why we must face this loss, how we're going to move beyond it. But then other people shut down. They hold their grief inward. They go inside themselves. They stay silent. They try to sort out what's going on with their feelings by themselves on their own. Maybe this is what we see in Aaron and his reaction. Perhaps he's silent because he's so overly stunned by what he just witnessed. Or is he accepting that this is simply God's will? I don't know. Yet within a few more verses further on in this portion, Aaron is calmly listening to God speak, and he continues on with the temple rituals. Some scholars interpret that his silence is an acknowledgement of God's just actions. Moses' words to Aaron following this surprising act are also puzzling. This is what the Lord meant when he said, "Through those near to me, I show myself holy and assert my authority before all the people." We must consider from our own modern Reformed Jewish perspective whether we see this act on God's part as being holy. We know that God is certainly showing his authority here. Whatever God was displeased with, he certainly dealt with it in a very authoritative manner. As we say, God works in mysterious ways. We are told this. And we're certainly within our realm to wonder about and to question God's swift and final show of authority here. These are troubling verses in our Torah. As we know, some parts of the Torah can be. They're not always easy to deal with. They're not always pretty. We can't always digest what we're supposed to get, but there must be some lesson, some guidance for us to be taken from this story of what happens to Aaron's sons. So it's kind of up to us to dig in and to find out. So I'm going to unmute people. You're all unmuted now. And we can just talk a little bit about this rather puzzling section of this Torah portion. If anybody have any thoughts they just want to throw out right from the beginning?
Just to throw out something right from the beginning, if I'm unmuted.
You are. Unmuted, everybody.
First of all, it makes me glad not to be of the priestly class. It sounds like a messy job, and if you do it wrong, it can be a very dangerous one. But yeah. I was looking at Edward Fox's translation as well as the Tanakh, and he quotes someone as having thought that the alien fire might have been incense associated with idolatry. So this still seems like an awfully severe punishment for idolatry, but I guess I'm wondering
his death.
What your thoughts are on that.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? And I mean, that's possible. I mean, like I said, there is so much written about these few verses because it has puzzled Torah scholars and rabbis and sages for so long, because it does seem like a very, very strong act of retribution for if it was incense that was related to some sort of idol worship or whatever. Okay, God would not be pleased about that, but it does seem like there could have been some maybe slightly less intense warning or whatever. Anybody else? Thoughts, questions, comments?
Well, in the another, I'm sorry.
You're echoing.
In another, never mind. Just listen.
Do you have it on? Some people, if they have two microphones on, for some reason, we get an echo. So I don't know if you're just using the microphone on your computer or if there's something else. Because it's happened to us in our meetings as well a couple times. Anyway, who else would like to chime in here?
Hi. My thoughts are you got to take a step back here and bring us into like two camps. If you're of the belief that the Torah was written by God and that every word is God's words, then it's very, very confusing. And as there's so many passages in the Torah that are. So I'm glad I'm not ultra-Orthodox who believe that.
Right.
I believe it was what they call this documentary hypothesis, where, it was written at different times by different people, and the different people may have had different motivations. I think then you kind of say, well, what could have been the motivations for them putting this in? I always thought Aaron got off pretty easily after he had built the golden calf and not discouraged it. And I think there's even a portion where he basically had built some sort of an altar to it. He took it upon himself, I think, in one place to build an altar. So I kind of reckon it's kind of like a message that Aaron knew his punishment was coming someday, and that he was reconciled to having something happen to him, and that he was not surprised that maybe it was in the form of his sons being consumed by fire or burnt. It could have been an accident that they burnt, or there could have been a real, good explanation of it, not that God burned. But the priest had inserted this at a particular time, possibly to show that
children are responsible for the father. No.
I'm sorry, Jeff, but the priests were at the time, I think, maybe who wrote it many, many years after Aaron, who interpreted this particular event, possibly could have wanted it as a warning, or the people who wrote it wanted it as a warning that the priests could not get away with these kind of things.
So, because they were kind of going beyond their authority, you weren't commanded to do this additional sacrifice. So this,
No,
this
no,
was
no. I think it was their authority in going to the golden calf.
oh, so this, like you said, sort
I
of
think it goes back to
late
the golden
retribution.
calf incident where, as I say, I think Aaron got off pretty easily after the golden calf incident. I mean, he comes out still as the high priest of Judaism, and he has really, no basically basic punishment, and he gets off scot-free, it seems to me.
Until now.
Till now. And yeah, so it's kind of like he's waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Well, it dropped pretty, it's a pretty big shoe, it would seem like to me. Anybody else thoughts on this? I mean, these are two men who are, they're of the priestly class. They're in the tent of meeting. They're offering, sacrifices, and then they decide to take it upon themselves to do an additional sacrifice.
Well,
Was-
it kind of seems like, in some ways, that even if you're a priest, you can't be too innovative. You better toe the line and follow the rules.
Okay.
Simply. And as far as Aaron's reaction, I don't put too much into it other than, my God, I don't know how I'd react if I saw both of my children, incinerated right before me,
Truly. True. What you say, there are rules. If you are in the priestly class, the sacrifices in the Torah are clearly spelled out, how they are to be offered, what's to be consumed, not consumed, by whom, where, etc. And it seems as if these two, I'll call them young men, I don't know how old they were, but these two young men decided to maybe take one step past what they were supposed to do. And this could be God's warning of saying, I've given you clear instructions on what I expect, what I want, and yet you decided to do beyond or do more, and God was maybe not happy about that.
If we go back to if we're going back to the golden calf theory, were Aaron's children present at the golden calf incident? Were they part of it? Larry, do you know?
I would think yes, just because it really consumed everybody. They were tired of waiting for Moses up on the mountain, and they were feeling like they needed some sort of leadership. And so the golden calf is built. And at least in my reading of the Torah, it seemed like the whole community rallied around this golden calf. And if that's the case, it would have included, I would assume, Aaron's sons in the whole group.
Okay.
Reading from something called Legends of the Bible, and there's an interesting commentary here about the golden calf. What it says is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
What it says is, the people then wanted to erect an altar for their idol, the golden calf. But Aaron tried to prevent this by saying to the people, it will be more reverential to your God if I build the idol in person. His expectation, however, was disappointed, for on the morning following the day when Aaron had at length completed the altar, Moses not yet at hand, and the people began to offer sacrifices to the idol and indulge in lewdness. So Aaron really goes a step beyond, in my opinion, if that legend is true, in that not only did he not discourage the people, but he said, look, he says, I've got this special power, and I'll build it for you. I'll build this idol, or I'll build this altar for the idol, in your behalf. So he is really, I think, stretching his authority here, and not only saying the idol's no good, but look, I'm going to build an altar for him. To me,
My reading on Aaron similarly has always been that he didn't seem to know what to do. He just kind of was afraid of this, for lack of a better word, rebellion that seemed to be fomenting among the people. And so his way of dealing with it was, as you just said, if this legend is true, to say, oh yeah, okay, I'll go along with it. In fact, I'll help you with it. And so he does. rather than trying to find some way of dealing with the people's anguish, their anger that Moses seemingly has left them, and in a more constructive way. So does that, what does that say about Aaron's leadership? I don't know.
Well, the other question, there's always these questionable things in the Bible. For example, Moses was instructed, I think, to speak to the rock.
Right.
Right. Instead, he goes up there and he uses his staff and he taps the rock.
Right.
And his punishment for that is that he will not be able to enter the land of Israel.
Exactly.
He has to stand on Mount Nebo or someplace in Jordan and look over the valley, which he could never really enter.
Right.
I mean, there are all of these unjust punishments, and if you believe that there's a just God, they're not good to, you can't explain it. The reward certainly doesn't fit, the punishment doesn't fit the reward here. So that's why I say, I'm back to the theory that, it's man written. People use the Moses striking the rock incident that he can't enter it into. It's time for Moses to give up his leadership. He's an old guy already, and maybe he's lost a step here or two. And so I've seen that kind of a midrash, a spin on it, so to speak.
Right.
But
And I mean,
unexplained things.
Right. And since none of us were there, I mean, we do see, as you said, frequently there are acts on the part of God that are acts of retribution, I guess, which is so interesting because last week's Torah portion that we do in the midst of Passover had just reiterated that God is compassionate, that God is a merciful God, that God has the ability to be forgiving. So we had just had this Torah portion a week ago talking about these wonderful 13 attributes of God that are all loving and wonderful and sort of warm and fuzzy. Then we come immediately to this Torah portion the week after, and it doesn't kind of, it seemingly work with the idea of a just, compassionate, loving God, unless I guess you could say this is, I guess, a form of justice. It's severe, but it's justice nonetheless. But it kind of flies in the face of what we were just told a week ago when we would read how, compassionate and merciful that God is.
Yeah, we had the good fortune last year to have a book discussion group with Rabbi Haas, and he came to Sun City. And the book that he selected for us to read was called The Many Faces of God.
Right.
And if you read the book, every chapter is by a very prominent theologian, rabbi, etc. And it gives their concept of what God is or is not. And if you start with the belief that God is this kind of person like Michelangelo has kind of created on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, this
Right.
figure who was sort of human, which is actually prohibited in the Second Commandment anyway,
Exactly.
to make his image that way. But if you start with that and you say God is kind of like a human figure, a father figure, a grandfather figure, then you're saying that he's a real person. Several of the rabbis that we read are all changed their kind of opinion of God, and I really have moved in that direction. That what God is not a person, but is a series of principles that have somehow come down to the world. And these are godly principles. So instead of God being the person, God is really more of an idea. And these are the things I think that Eric Fromm and that the rabbi who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Kushner,
Yeah.
some of those rabbis have come around to thinking about that God is really more in the principles, that these are the principles with which the world was created, just like they created the principles of gravity somehow, we don't know how, the principles of the laws of thermodynamics and physics and chemistry and the order. There is this order that was set upon us that these godly principles were created. It's not a person that we're praying to.
Right.
We're praying that everybody should obey these principles. And I think if you take that as a point of view and you don't look for God to intervene in creating miracles and things like that, but somehow these principles just don't get followed all the time. Sometimes a bridge falls down because we thought we knew how to build it, and yet, well, a stronger wind comes along, or that more traffic or a heavier vehicle comes on the bridge, or it develops a crack or something like that, and we didn't fully understand it. And here the principles are generally, if you believe in the godly principles, several of which are in the Ten Commandments, others of which are, even broader, I think you adopt a different vision of what God is. He's not this person.
No, I agree. God has never been for me. I mean, we, like Michelangelo, anthropomorphized God with that Sistine Chapel. That's never worked, at least for me. I mean, and I know people have to figure out for themselves. As you state, God to me is more of how we should ethically live our lives in a principled way. And that's outlined for us in the Ten Commandments, in the Torah. I mean, that's where we go for our principles and ethics of Judaism come to us from the Torah. And it is sort of more, I do think it's more of an idea. Maybe there is a presence somehow. I mean, interestingly enough, this morning, I mean, I'm a music freak, so I read a lot of stuff about music. I had a vast record collection. There's a musical rock and roll artist called Nick Cave. And there was an article that actually Caleb found in the New Musical Express talking about prayer. And Nick Cave says, you can pray and you don't necessarily have to believe in God or a God to pray. He says, there are probably right now in the world more people praying because of this, pandemic that the world is facing. So people are praying, but it doesn't necessarily mean, and his idea is that praying is more an examination of looking inside yourself and looking at who you are, which does kind of tie in with the idea of Jewish prayer, because Jewish prayer, by definition, is supposed to be taking stock of yourself and making, some idea of where are you in this sort of ethical principled world. And if that's what God is, then it all kind of makes sense. Do you have to have God to be an ethical person, a principled person? I know people who call themselves atheists who are very ethical and very principled. So I'm just throwing that out there because it just kind of made me think of what you were talking about.
There are atheists that do have godly visions or do have godly principles. Absolutely. Many of them do, believe. Yeah, ethically.
Right.
Correct.
Oh, completely.
Yeah, the whole business of secular Judaism, I think is based on that, not one of the three mainstreams of Judaism, it's humanitarian Judaism, so to speak.
Yeah. Right. One other commentary, when I was looking at this Torah portion, and it was when I was reading it, it was just this part that struck me. So that's why I decided to focus on it. But one commentator a couple of commentators, different rabbis who were writing about this incident, said that this was God's warning, if you will, about being too zealous. God's warning about being too much in religious fervor. Because these two gentlemen overstepped their bounds, thinking they could do more, they could be more, they could offer more, that this is God saying, I don't want you to become too overly zealous. And because their theory is that oftentimes religious zealotry turns into something very bad and very evil. And I thought, well, that was kind of an interesting look, or an interesting sort of take on it as well. So by them overstepping their bounds and, trying to be somewhat zealous in their practices and their sacrifices, God was saying, I don't want that. I don't really see that as necessary. So I don't know. I just thought that was sort of an interesting take on it as well.
I did go to, I remember hearing, I went to a Shabbat service where the topic of zealots was what was being preached on, and the rabbi there talked about how you can take zealotry too far in the wrong direction, but in life we really do need zealots, because it really takes a zealot to push certain things forward. And so there he talked about zealots in the positive direction and zealots in the negative direction. And so I had never thought about it that way, but it was several years ago, but we have zealots that we use. And so I think that it benefits us to think of that as in a positive and a negative direction.
True. I mean, I look at some of these, like, I guess, television preachers. The gentleman who the other day said that he was going to blow the coronavirus away. He's so much fervor. I'm such a man of God, and I'm just going to blow it away. And we're going to gather, in the church together, even though we're told not to. And I guess when I look at that kind of zealotry, I'm thinking, oh, this is bordering, at least in my mind, on sort of lunacy.
Yeah, we think of that, but couldn't we use? Wasn't it the story of Dinah where you could almost say that was zealotry?
I guess I guess we would have to look at zealotry in sort of steps. There's zealotry that is, not really stepping over lines that are dangerous, and then when it does, I guess then it moves into something where you need to pull it back and rein it in a little bit.
And I think what the rabbi was saying, although it was several years ago, he was saying that sometimes zealotry moves us in a direction we need to go.
I think you got to look at zealotry as being, there's false zealotry. Like if you claim it's in the name of God, everything you're doing, I mean, because God inspired me to do this, I mean, that's a spin that will take you in the wrong direction, because that's an intolerant kind of zealotry. There are people that go overboard, in my opinion, in performing the rituals of the religion and don't understand the godly principles, so to speak. And I think that's another form of zealotry. So, but there are zealots who are, preaching the good word. So it's hard to label that. Zealotry has taken on a very negative connotation, and I think
Definitely.
that it generally does, because it generally, you got this guy of a zealot is someone who doesn't understand and is not willing to listen to or compromise anybody else's position. And those are certain kind of zealots. And they do have following, unfortunately, but I think
They do. Yeah, they do, for sure.
They do.
I don't know. It was just one other take that I saw in some of the commentaries that I was reading earlier in the week, that this was sort of God's way of saying, yes, I want people to live godly, ethical principled lives, but by the same token, there's a point at which you're going to take a step too far, and maybe that was a warning toward, keeping yourself somewhat reined in. I don't know.
But I think those once again take us back as to what is your image of God, and which denomination of Judaism you belong to. If you're the ultra Orthodox, that probably then you need some sort of an explanation to hold on to in order to understand that God wrote this book, the Torah.
Right.
And basically, I've got to give some kind of an explanation so that they come up with some sort of an explanation. If you believe that it was written by people, then you could say people are fragile. They were intending to make a point. We'll never understand what was in the writer's mind at the particular time. Putting together the Torah seems to be a compromise, of many different styles and forms at different times anyway. So if you adopt that, you could say, well, it's a fallible document. It's a history. There are some good lessons in it and some lessons that maybe we shouldn't be following.
Well, I don't know if you remember, I think it was 2 years ago, for Mikveh Israel's anniversary service. We had Rabbi Saperstein was here and did the Devar Torah at the service on Saturday. And I don't remember exactly what the Torah portion was, but it was one of those that's sort of like this. It's not an easy one. It doesn't lend itself easily to a nice modern interpretation. But what I remember most about his sermon, his Devar Torah, was he said, there are pieces in the Torah that are just sometimes not so nice, and in fact, downright ugly. I mean, he used the word ugly. He said, but we can't pretend like they're not there. We can't just gloss over them because they make us, scratch our heads and they're uncomfortable for us. We still have to deal with them and try to make some sense of them. And I kind of felt that way a little bit about this. I thought back to his words and I thought, you're just looking at this at face value. It seems very extreme, but yet it's here. It's part of the Torah. And as you said, a collection of various writers, somebody putting together, I mean, as an English teacher, I can see shifts in tone when they put things together and shifts in point of view and why we have the repetition in the Torah that we do. But yet this is our document. This is our ethics, our principles of Judaism. And if we have this amalgamation of writers and stories, for some reason, it was felt that it was important to keep this. You know, when they're putting it together, they felt like they needed to keep this in the Torah. Why?
But I think what has happened, I think, as everybody understands, is that, you know, I wouldn't say the Torah has been superseded, but when Rabbinic Judaism took hold now, Rabbinic Judaism institute, you know, with the destruction of the temple and the sacrifices were no longer, you know, available. And we had all of this diaspora, and the rabbis took over. So the rabbis now had the problem of how do you reconcile, you know, things that were in the Torah compared to, you know, everyday practice living in a foreign land, for example. And I think they've had to adapt, you know, to the laws and of these particular foreign lands. So I think that what's happened is that to a large extent, we look at the Torah, at least as Reform Jews, I think we look at the Torah as a book. We don't believe every word of it, sorry to say. And
No, we don't.
take the good points and the points that are not so good, maybe we leave to the Orthodox to explain to themselves, and we nod our heads, and you know, if that satisfies them, let them have those. But it's a very unsatisfying explanation as to, you know, why some of these things happen.
Well, I don't exactly agree, but I do feel that the Torah tells us how not to act. And in so doing, because God did give us free choice, and God could be a spirit, God could be whatever you want God to be. Nonetheless, man has free choice and must make choices all the time as to what's good and what's bad. And perhaps seeing stories that are not to our satisfaction, how we would like our ancestors to act or ourselves to act, you can say, gee, you know, this is not right. This is not what was intended for a good life towards yourself, towards other people.
Well, I agree with that. The thing that I disagree with is that it's not only how we should act or not act, but it's how God should act and not act. I think that's where this Torah portion comes in, you know, and we're trying to grapple with not how other people are acting, but how is God acting? Is he acting justly or unjustly in this? Does he, you know, it really questions why would God have done such a thing? And the only explanation, like I say, I can come up with is that, you know, possibly it's a retribution to the golden calf, that the punishment was there waiting. God was waiting for a moment. If you believe in that kind of a God, if you believe in a non-interventionist God who only gave us the principles, you know, of good human relationships, then it's very hard. And then I'll leave it to the people, you know, just to come up with the other theories as far as, well, that satisfy them. Well, you know, maybe these guys went too far, maybe they did this or that. I mean, you know, I don't take much credence in those, but, you know, because I don't believe in, you know, that God really did this. But the fire occurred, it may have been an accident, you know, I think there's some explanation for it.
I mean, truly, I mean, as we know, you know, playing with fire is dangerous. It's why we're taught as children not to. And it could be something that just happened to go wrong at that moment, you know.
It's not an accident, and fire came forth from the Lord. But building on some of the comments about how, you know, what God is like, I think you can say that God is portrayed as all powerful, but not the best model for human behavior. It seems like there's this recurrence of an angry God. So you can look at it as a God who has an anger management problem, not necessarily a model for how humans should be.
A little discussion we had.
Interesting.
You
Well,
know,
I mean,
Tim,
yes.
I just want to make a brief statement. This actually confuses and upsets me. And I feel, you know, all this, and I feel like, yeah, you can have a category of 100 different categories. Everybody thinks something else. I feel like a lot of it is fiction. And sometimes I feel a little down about it because I don't know what to believe. It doesn't, in other words, it doesn't, it's not positive for me. That's my feeling.
This particular,
Doubt. I have doubt.
and
Rena, did you mean in the belief that there is a God? that is
Well,
confusing?
what it is, what he would do, I feel like I'd rather believe that the terrible things he did, the revenge, was fiction written by man. That makes me feel better, you know, because now in this present day, the way we live, God doesn't do anything. He doesn't have revenge. He doesn't have anything. We just have to believe in him. We don't hear or feel or see anything. You know what I'm trying to say?
so you feel like right now in our modern world, God is not an interventionist. He doesn't bring his hand down to
Right.
a particular
Exactly.
act.
Exactly.
That's right.
Okay, true.
That's kind of where like some of the other people that we read about, Rena,
Yeah.
they come into it. Now they say that supposing everybody abided by all of these godly principles, and that we were all basically friendly, and that we could all cooperate, and that we could all do wonderful things and had that same belief.
Yeah.
Is saying, even if it's not praying to the same person, because as soon as you start praying to different people, but if you pray to the belief, you know, that people are good, that there are good things in the world, you can accomplish a whole bunch of good things. And I think it may not happen in our generation, but you've got to, that's where the faith comes in. The faith comes in that there are godly principles, that if everybody believed in these godly principles, irrespective of how they did it, I think that's where the goal is, and that's how faith can be restored. That's what I think some of these scholars, Rabbi Kushner and some of the others. So it's not a hopeless situation. It's a hopeless situation, I think, if you're not ultra orthodox. If you're ultra orthodox, you come up with your own different Mishnahs and spin, I'll call it, on the Torah portions. But if you're not ultra orthodox and you don't want to believe in this Michelangelo-esque concept of God, then you really have a problem. And that's why I've come to the godly principle things, that if we all adopt godly principles, we can build better bridges, we can get rid of the coronavirus, we can stop having wars and stuff like that. Maybe not in our generation, but maybe they will be exposed in future generations. Maybe it's our children's children.
Well, and a lot of
believe in people, then if the faith is among humans, believing in the good in humans.
It's a faith that I think that there are ethical principles that have somehow come down into the world, just like physical principles have come down into the world. They're not as ordered. They're not like what we learned in chemistry, where atoms combine in certain combinations, and we understand a little bit of how that's done. We understand a little bit of the genetic makeup of people, but it's taken centuries for us to understand that. And I think that Abraham's vision, where maybe instead of all of these other gods that he had, where people were fighting against each other and a war comes and I'll bring my God, you bring your God, and we'll bring our best person, and whoever wins, then that's the God of the people. He's saying that, maybe there is only one God, and the one God could be all these just godly principles.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Larry.
Well, and every time we go to Shabbat services and we pray the Aleinu prays for the day when everyone will recognize that there is the one God, however that concept is in each individual person's mind. But I think they were like recognizing the concepts of, equality, the ethics, the responsibilities. And that's what really, as modern Reformed Jews, when we're looking, we no longer are looking for a Messiah, Mashiach, whatever. We are looking for the dawn of a messianic age. And that messianic age is very much what Larry talked about, when everybody is living by, call them godly principles and ethics for now, and we respect each other and we all work toward the greater good of humanity, regardless of whatever we call our particular religious path or persuasion, or no religious path or persuasion. That's what the Messianic age, as I understand it from modern Reform rabbis, that's what we're working for. We're not really waiting for some Messiah to come down and, make everything right. So when we are looking for that time period when everybody recognizes those ethics and principles, which then, Rena, is we have to believe in each other. I mean, think about what one of Anne Frank's most famous quotes, when, everything going on around her in the world she lived in, and yet she makes the famous statement that, deep inside, I still believe that people are good at heart.
Right.
Even in what she was living through. So that's kind of where we have to be, looking for that good at heart that's in everybody. Not that we're perfect, because at least I'm not. I don't try to pretend that I am. But that's kind of where our faith comes in. And if that's a concept of God, that believing in the godliness of our fellow human beings, and that's kind of where I am, actually.
So what do you say about the world in general, where there's so much turmoil and not everybody is certainly not on the same page at all?
No. Well, I mean, look at it. We're waiting for the time when people recognize this idea of godly principles and ethics. It hasn't happened yet. And it was Jane who said, we have free will. So we have free will to believe in, for us, whatever is the principles and ethics that are right for us. And for some people, they're very different from what we think, and it causes conflict. And so we have a lot of work to do. I mean, and part of our mission as Reformed Jews is tikkun olam, repair the world. So each one of us does whatever we can. We're contributing our piece. None of us can be expected to do it by ourselves.
No, of course not.
It's way too much.
Someday.
So, well, that's what we are praying for. I mean, like I said, when we pray the Aleinu, if you look at the translation, the English translation, it is praying. We are literally praying for the day when everybody recognizes one God, but in recognizing one God, recognizing the ethics and principles of living a good life, or if you want to call it a godly life. That's what we're waiting for. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go.
I just have a quick story. It's, with the coronavirus happening and being very bad up in New York, New Jersey, I don't know if any of you are aware of how the Hasidic community is acting.
Yes.
They don't care, and they just go by their own rules, and they're violating everything, going out, doing everything. And I just wonder, how could we ever be on the same page with our own people, so to speak? I'll never understand it. It bothers me. What can I tell you?
Well, it bothers, I think, when we know that we've been told things about the spread of the disease, and we see people who flaunt it. I mean, look at what happened in Michigan yesterday.
Yeah.
You had.
What happened?
There were people gathering at the state capitol because they're angry at their governor. She has imposed very strict shelter in place.
Right.
And so they defied it. They went out, they met, they were not keeping socially distant, and saying, you're not taking away our constitutional rights by making us, stay at home, not go to bars, not go to restaurants, not do the things that we want to do.
Right.
So they're flaunting in the same way rules that have been set down to try to protect the greater good of the health of the people of the country.
Right.
So,
well, that's what's happening.
Well, one of the ways that the Jewish people have survived, because they've been in so many different lands, has been that they have obeyed the laws of those particular lands that they were there. I mean, I remember years ago, we were in the synagogue in Amsterdam, and they had a big exhibit there of how the Jews that came to Amsterdam at the time, had to adopt certain laws and principles and follow certain legal laws and principles of that land. Now, unfortunately, there are, as you say, in the Hasidic community, there are people that are in the other religions, that you talked about, some of these mega temples and mega churches, that want to blow the virus away, and they don't act by the laws that on behalf of everybody else. But in general, I remember seeing a movie years ago. I think it was called, I forget the title of the movie, but it was really about the Hasidic community in New York. And what they talked about in the film, and they actually followed some of them around, was that many of them had stores in New York City, for example, in the Camera District and the Jewelry
Right.
District and places like that. And these were people who had come to the United States after World War II. It was called A World Apart, was the name of the film. And it was a documentary. Maybe
I remember that. Yeah.
And really the story was about how these communities came here not to be American citizens and not to assimilate, which has become a very bad word, but they came here to create a world that they had known in the shtetls of Europe and places like that. But now they found that they couldn't do that, that they found that they had to be Jews on Friday and Saturday, and then on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, they had to operate a store. And they showed these ultra-Orthodox women now who were selling cameras and jewelry and handing money over to non-Jewish people and, in stores. And that was the way they were doing. Now, maybe in time, they will change. The whole thing happened with vaccinations, if you recall, prior to this, with a lot of the people in some of the religious communities that faith healers and things of that nature.
Right.
So yeah, there are people on the outskirts, whether they're religious or not, who want to blow the virus away. They don't have to be Hasidic. They don't have to be, evangelical. There are people that just think, I have the immunity, or God has given it to me, or I'm super strong, or something like that. So,
Right.
Yeah,
Okay,
but the point is, they don't care about other people. In other words, do they not realize that they are infecting others? That's my point.
Right. No, they don't seem to care. They don't understand that a lot of what's in place is we're looking out for the rest of humanity. We're not just doing this for ourselves, but it's for all of humanity, so that we can hopefully, as we learn more about this, and great minds are working on vaccinations and everything, greater minds than mine. In the meantime, this is what we can do to help protect all of us.
Correct.
I'm not just protecting me. What I'm doing is protecting everyone else that lives in my community. So it is a community thing.
They're very insular. Many of these communities are very insular.
They are.
That what they do is, we have a form of Judaism where, Rabbi Haas is certainly our leader, and we look to him for leadership and inspiration. But if he told us to do something that we did not believe in, we wouldn't do it.
Right.
In one of these Hasidic communities, you were almost totally loyal to that particular rabbi or faith, just like in the Catholic religion, they had hoped that you'd be loyal to the Pope. We don't have that in Judaism. We're very, very fortunate. I think a lot of these communities just are so dominated by their rabbi. And if their rabbi were to come out and say something, that yes, you've got a social distance. We're not going to have, services on Saturday where everybody is, right on top of each other. We're not going to have these wonderful kiddushes anymore. They might do it as well. So, but we're very, very fortunate to, in my opinion, to believe in the kind of Judaism as most of the world does.
Right. Well, and my rabbi in Ohio always said, Reform Judaism is informed Judaism. We are informed people, and we act accordingly with information that we have, the best information that we can get. And I really believe that. I really believe that's kind of what Reform Judaism. We have information, we are informed, and we act accordingly.
Well, I'm up here in Ohio. I used to be in Savannah, and there is a Orthodox shul here that is run by the Hasidim, and we haven't. And I go back and forth between the Reform and the Hasidim because we free flow quite easily up here. And there have been no services or anything in person for over a month at with the Hasidim here.
What type of Hasidic community is it? Are they Chabad? What are they?
They're Chabad, and
That's
but
different.
they're really good with online. They have got, I've been going to the study group there. There's a great rabbi. I mean, but nobody's met in person. We had an over 50 people, 50 women get together through the Hasidim up here. And so I think it bears to be careful when we put labels on people.
No, it's very true, because the Chabad is really not a part of this. These are some of these other ultra-Orthodox religious groups in New York, New Jersey, who are not Chabad necessarily, who have decided that they're not going to follow what's been asked. Chabad is not that way. The Chabad here in Savannah has worked very much under the restrictions. I have very good friends in Fort Lauderdale who have a huge Chabad down there. They too have worked very much within the restrictions during Passover to see that people had what they needed, but under the restrictions put in place by the government. So yeah, it's not a blanket. We're not with one brush. There are different forms of ultra-Orthodox that follow different rebbes, and some of these rebbes have flaunted some of the rules. And it's put people in danger, which is why they have the rate that they have of infected people. I mean, regardless of religion, Judaism, Catholic, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, we all should be doing our part to protect our fellow human beings, the way I look at it.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I work in that field, and I agree. We have to hunker down.
Right. Well, I'm going to let you all go. We had a good hour discussion here. I appreciate all of you joining me, and hopefully you'll join me again next week. Tell your friends. It's the place to be at 1 o'clock on Friday is Torah study. But this was good. I mean, there's so much that we have to talk about in our faith. And the Torah lets us jump off into so many different things. And here's a whole Torah portion, and we started with 2 or 3 verses, and we discussed for an hour, and we could probably go even longer. It's great mental exercise. It's great to be able to have at least this kind of tool to connect with everybody. And so I hope you will be back next Friday, 1 o'clock, same place, same time. I wish all of you a great Shabbat.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you. I gotta run. Thank you, Tim.
Bye, Tim.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so
Tim,
much.
thank you.
Goodbye.
It's interesting. I may come back.
All righty.